They came in their Sunday best. Men in pressed slacks. Women in light dresses, clutching children's hands. Flags were raised. Songs were sung. Speeches rang out in the warm May sun. They called it a picnic, but it was more than that. This was a movement, a moment, a stand. But by the end of the afternoon, the grass was soaked in blood. The American flag was trampled into the dirt, and bodies, dozens of them, were scattered like discarded paper dolls in a South Chicago field. And the killers? They were in uniform. This is the story of one of the most brutally suppressed labor uprisings in American history. A massacre so egregious, so naked in its injustice, that even the sanitized newsreels of the time couldn't quite bleach it clean. A crime committed not in the shadows, but in full daylight. Not by rogues, but by the sanctioned protectors of law and order. And not against criminals, but against working men and women who dared to demand the right to unionize. On May 30, 1937, Memorial Day, 1,000 steelworkers and their families marched toward the gates of Republic Steel in South Chicago. They carried banners. They sang Union songs. They demanded recognition. What they got was gunfire. 13 dead. Dozens more wounded. Hundreds arrested. And an official cover-up that stretched from the Chicago Police Department all the way to the Roosevelt White House. This wasn't just a massacre, it was a message. To the American labor movement, to anyone who thought that corporate power could be challenged, to anyone who thought that the First Amendment still applied when the rich were afraid. Step out of line and you die. And what makes it worse, what makes it criminal, is that the perpetrators were never brought to justice. There were no trials, no convictions, no national day of mourning. Instead, the dead were labeled agitators, the survivors were branded as communists, and the truth was buried under layers of state and corporate propaganda. But not today. Today, we're going to unearth it. We'll go behind the headlines, past the propaganda reels, into the interrogation rooms, the hospital wards, the company boardrooms, and the tear-gassed fields of Chicago's East Side. We'll name names of the officers who fired, the executives who ordered it, the politicians who pretended it never happened. And we'll tell the story of the workers, the men and women who stood together, who fought for dignity and died for it. This is the story of the 1937 Memorial Day Massacre. And you're listening to AI True Crime. Chapter 1. The Iron Kingdom. Before the bullets, before the blood, before the screams, there was steel. And in 1937, steel meant power. Steel girded the cities of America, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Gary, Youngstown. It forged the weapons of war, the rails of empire, the skeletons of skyscrapers. It was a product of blood and heat and endless labor, and its masters, the men who controlled it, were kings in all but crown. The biggest of them all? U.S. Steel, a behemoth formed in 1901 by J.P. Morgan himself, swallowing Andrew Carnegie's empire and fusing it with the steelworks of Illinois and Pennsylvania into the first billion-dollar corporation in world history. It was a juggernaut, too big to fight, too rich to touch. For decades, it crushed union efforts like flies under a boot. But by the 1930s, things were shifting. The Great Depression had wrecked American confidence, but had also exposed deep, structural wounds. Poverty was rampant. Bread lines wrapped around corners. And while industry executives still played golf at exclusive country clubs, the workers who made them rich were starving. It was the New Deal era. Franklin Roosevelt was in the White House, and he was giving organized labor something they had never really had before: federal protection. The Wagner Act of 1935, the National Labor Relations Act, made it illegal for companies to punish workers for unionizing. For the first time, the law was on the side of the laborer. And into this new, dangerous climate came the CIO. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, born from the American Federation of Labor's refusal to organize industrial workers, was young, militant, and bold. Where the AFL had focused on skilled trades, carpenters, electricians, typists, the CIO went for the massive, unorganized industries: auto, rubber, textiles, steel. In 1936, they scored their first major victory. The United Auto Workers, backed by the CIO, launched a sit-down strike at General Motors in Flint, Michigan. It was dramatic. It was national news. It ended with GM recognizing the union. This was the spark. Labor across America saw what was possible. And next on the list? Steel. But not U.S. Steel, at least not at first. The CIO approached the smaller companies first: Bethlehem, Inland, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, and Republic Steel, collectively known as Little Steel. The idea was strategic. get Little Steel on board, then pressure Big Steel with a united front. But Republic Steel was a fortress. Its president, Tom Girdler, was an anti-union fanatic. A mechanical engineer turned corporate executioner, Girdler saw unions not as an inevitability of capitalism, but as a personal insult. He had once told reporters that if a union ever came to Republic, he would rather shut the entire company down than recognize it. And he meant it. Girdler stocked his plants with private guards, hired Pinkertons, funded strikebreakers, and maintained personal relationships with police departments and city governments. He didn't just oppose unions, he hunted them. And he had help. Chicago's Mayor Edward J. Kelly, nominally a Democrat and a Roosevelt man, was in the pocket of business interests. The Chicago Police Department, notorious for brutality, made clear where their sympathies lay. When union organizers tried to rally outside Republic's gates, cops were dispatched not to keep the peace, but to prepare for war. But the workers were ready too. The CIO had launched what they called the Little Steel Strike, a coordinated series of labor actions targeting the anti-union steel companies. Republic Steel was the central front. In Chicago, thousands of workers were already organized. The local chapter of the Steel Workers Organizing Committee, SWOC, had built a movement. They had the numbers. They had the will. What they didn't have was recognition. Republic refused to negotiate. They refused to even sit down. Girdler was preparing for a siege. And so, on May 26, 1937, the strike officially began. It was immediate. It was massive. Plants in Chicago, Cleveland, and Youngstown were hit. Workers poured out of the mills and into the streets, chanting, marching, raising signs. "We want a union." Girdler responded by barricading his plants and calling the police. He ordered the hiring of hundreds of strikebreakers, including armed thugs. The company began stockpiling weapons, and in Chicago a line was drawn. Witnesses described bodies dropping like wheat in a scythe. Still the shooting continued. Strikers who fell to the ground were clubbed. Police charged the wounded. Women were beaten. One officer was seen using his nightstick on a man already unconscious. Another dragged a woman by the hair across the gravel. It lasted less than 5 minutes. 10 men were dead before the ambulances arrived. 3 more would die later in the hospital. Dozens were wounded, 55 by gunfire. Over 100 were arrested. No police officers were injured. Not one. The press was stunned, but not entirely truthful. Major newspapers, including the Chicago Tribune, reported that the police had been attacked by a mob. They printed headlines like "Steel Strike Rioters Assault Police" and "Communist Agitators Shot in Chicago Riot." The version of events presented to the public bore almost no resemblance to what had actually occurred. But someone had been watching. Paramount newsreel had sent a camera crew to the event. And what they captured on film would, weeks later, contradict every official statement. The footage, grainy, black and white, but damning, showed the crowd retreating as they were fired upon. It showed children running. It showed unarmed men being gunned down. It showed brutality. And it was suppressed. Paramount was pressured by the city and Republic Steel to bury the footage. At first, they complied. The reels were withheld. Screenings were canceled. But under growing pressure from labor groups and leftist publications, portions of the footage were eventually shown in 1938 before a Senate committee. The images shocked the nation briefly. But justice never came. None of the police officers were charged. No disciplinary actions were taken. Tom Girdler kept his job. Republic Steel continued its anti-union crusade. The CIO filed lawsuit after lawsuit. But the massacre faded from public memory. Memorial Day was reclaimed for barbecues and baseball. The bloodstains on Burleigh Avenue faded. But the families didn't forget. And neither should we. Chapter 3. The Blood on the Badges. The smoke had barely cleared when the first lie was told. It came fast. Automatic. Like muscle memory. As if someone somewhere had planned it. A Chicago Police Department spokesperson told reporters the strikers had turned violent. They claimed officers were attacked with bricks and clubs, that an armed mob had attempted to storm Republic Steel's gates, that the officers had no choice but to defend themselves. It was, according to the official line, a battle. Not a massacre. Not a crime. But as bodies were wheeled into Cook County Hospital, the truth seeped through the walls like blood through bandages. None of the dead had weapons. Not a single firearm. Not a knife. Not even a credible report of a brick hitting an officer. The worst police injury? A sprained ankle self-inflicted during the charge. No gunshot wounds. No bruises. No trauma. And yet, 13 people were dead. So the narrative had to shift. That's when the labels came out. Agitators. Communists. Outside influencers. These were the smears the police, the city, and Republic Steel relied on to muddy the waters. The Chicago Tribune ran front-page editorials accusing the CIO of being infiltrated by the Soviet Union. Mayor Edward Kelly's office released statements claiming radical elements had hijacked the peaceful strike. Even President Roosevelt refused to comment. The same FDR whose New Deal had empowered the labor movement now stood silent. Some historians say he feared alienating the democratic machine in Chicago. Others argue he didn't want to be seen as pro-union, while Little Steel's executives held such sway in the financial sector. But the silence spoke volumes. The hearings begin. It wasn't until weeks later, under enormous pressure from labor leaders, civil rights groups, and sympathetic senators, that a federal inquiry was launched. The Senate Committee on Education and Labor, chaired by Senator Robert M. La Follette Jr., opened hearings into the violence. Witnesses were summoned. Survivors testified. One man, Joseph Roth, described watching his best friend bleed out in the grass. Another, Maria Lopez, spoke of how her husband had been shot in the back while helping their son find shelter behind a parked car. Several workers who had been arrested told of beatings in the paddy wagons, of being kicked and insulted in custody. And then came the footage. In August 1937, the committee obtained the Paramount newsreel, raw, unedited, black-and-white film that captured the moments leading up to, during, and after the massacre. It was damning. The footage showed police forming a tight skirmish line, the crowd advancing peacefully, tear gas being deployed before any confrontation, officers raising shotguns and firing into a retreating crowd, wounded men being beaten with clubs as they lay on the ground. Senator La Follette called it the most brutal suppression of constitutional rights I have ever witnessed. And for a brief moment, the nation was stunned. Newspapers across the country published stills from the footage. Labor leaders demanded criminal indictments. Eleanor Roosevelt was said to be privately horrified. Paramount, facing public scrutiny, allowed a heavily edited version of the footage to be screened in some theaters under the title, Republic Steel Strike Riot. But even the name betrayed the truth. It wasn't a riot. It was a slaughter. The police testimony. When the officers finally took the stand before the Senate committee, their stories were straight. Too straight. Memorized. Each claimed to have feared for his life. They spoke of a mob of threats of anarchist chants. When shown the footage, most shrugged it off. One officer, Patrolman James Flannery, claimed the film had been edited. Another insisted, with a straight face, that the workers had guns hidden under their clothes. There was no physical evidence for this. None was ever presented. Not one gun was recovered from the scene. Not one officer required medical attention for an assault. But the uniform still protected them. The badge insulated them. The committee issued a scathing report. They called the massacre a flagrant violation of civil liberties. They accused the Chicago police of excessive force bordering on the sadistic. They condemned Republic Steel's militarized response to a lawful strike. But it ended there. No officers were charged. No one was fired. No financial penalties were imposed on Republic Steel. Instead, Tom Girdler doubled down. He issued a press release stating he was proud of the police and that communist subversion has no place in America's industrial future. He would die years later, rich and unrepentant. The legacy of erasure. What followed was a slow, deliberate forgetting. The massacre was not taught in schools. No monument was raised. The city of Chicago never formally acknowledged what happened. Police records were quietly sealed. Republic Steel continued to operate under anti-union policies for years. When the Paramount footage resurfaced in labor circles in the 1940s, it was treated almost like contraband, proof of a truth that official America didn't want remembered. The steel industry fought back hard. Lobbyists worked overtime to reframe the narrative. By the 1950s, the Memorial Day Massacre was a footnote. By the 1970s, it was an urban myth. But the blood never really washed away. Today, labor historians and union activists have begun to reinsert the Memorial Day Massacre into the American memory. Some call it Chicago's Kent State. Others say that's too soft. Because here there were no students. No war protest. No confusion. Just working people in the open, gunned down in broad daylight by their own government for daring to ask for rights they were legally entitled to. This wasn't a moment of confusion. It was a message. And the badge was part of it. Chapter 4. Republic's War Room. There's a saying in labor circles. Bosses don't negotiate. They calculate. Tom M. Girdler didn't sit behind a desk. He sat behind a fortress. In 1937, Republic Steel was the third-largest steel manufacturer in the United States and the most openly anti-union. Its president Girdler was not just a businessman, he was a zealot. He believed, to his bones, that labor unions were a communist plot to undermine American industry. To him, negotiation was weakness. Compromise was betrayal. And collective bargaining? Treason. And so, long before the first tear gas grenade was fired, long before the first bullet ripped through the air, Republic Steel was preparing for war. The planning phase, steel against the worker. When the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, began organizing the steel industry in earnest, Republic's boardrooms turned paranoid. Internal memos recovered years later from Girdler's personal files, since archived at Case Western Reserve University, reveal that as early as January 1937, Republic had approved extraordinary security allocations at all of its plants. These weren't for cameras or fences. These were for weapons, ammunition, and private armies. Girdler authorized the purchase of 700 new riot batons, a stockpile of tear gas canisters supplied discreetly by local police connections, the installation of searchlights and machine gun emplacements on mill rooftops in Cleveland and Youngstown, the recruitment of private strikebreakers, many with criminal backgrounds, from firms like the Pinkerton Agency and the Burns Detective Agency. These were not defensive moves. They were preemptive strikes. The executives knew a strike was likely. They wanted it to come, not just to beat it, but to break the movement permanently. Girdler's doctrine, make it hurt. Tom Girdler wasn't subtle. In 1934, he had personally overseen the violent suppression of a strike at Republic's Cleveland plant. When pressed on whether he'd talk to the workers, he said, "You don't talk to a fever. You break it." By 1937, Girdler had surrounded himself with hardliners, men who viewed labor not as partners in production, but as enemy insurgents. His executive council included James G. Arnold, VP of Operations and former National Guard Colonel; Clifford A. Wilkins, Director of Plant Security, who had once helped suppress coal miner strikes in West Virginia; Raymond Dean, legal counsel and strategist for anti-union litigation. Together, they created what workers nicknamed the War Room. It was a locked office on the top floor of Republic's Chicago office building. Inside, maps of all Republic facilities marked with Union hotspots, dossiers on suspected agitators, and allegedly surveillance photos taken by hired infiltrators. Espionage as a weapon. Republic didn't just play defense. It infiltrated. According to testimony provided in 1938 by Howard Lester, a former Pinkerton informant, the company paid dozens of men to join CIO chapters under false pretenses. These spies recorded membership lists, reported the times and locations of meetings, sabotaged organizational efforts by planting false rumors of infighting, instigated arguments to provoke arrests or police raids. In one Cleveland plant, an informant reportedly lit a fire during a union meeting just to have it shut down under city ordinance. They weren't just undermining labor. They were baiting them. Because Republic's strategy hinged on the idea that violence was inevitable, that if they pushed hard enough, the workers would snap, and then the company could say, "Look, these aren't citizens. These are thugs." The pre-massacre coordination. In the days leading up to May 30th, the War Room kicked into overdrive. Republic executives met privately with senior police officials, including South Chicago's Captain James Mooney and representatives from the mayor's office. Memos suggest Republic requested, and received, an increased police presence, including officers with military experience and access to riot gear. Girdler himself was in Chicago that week. While he avoided press conferences, he was known to have stayed at the Blackstone Hotel, where meetings were held between Republic legal counsel and city liaisons. What was discussed in those rooms? We may never know in full, but we know the result. A line of armed police officers waited in a field. Tear gas was stacked in wooden crates. Shotguns were loaded with live ammunition. And no one, not a soul in power, told them to stand down. Was it a setup? Many historians now believe the Memorial Day Massacre wasn't just an overreaction. It was a calculated provocation. Girdler knew a peaceful strike might garner sympathy. A bloody one? That could be spun. And it was. Within hours of the massacre, Republic's press machine was at work. Corporate PR staff distributed a pre-written statement to local papers, blaming communist agitators for starting a riot. Newsreels were denied access to the site. Survivors were arrested and gagged by police order. Hospitals were warned not to let press interview the injured. This wasn't panic. This was protocol. And it worked. For a while. Fallout within the ranks. Not every Republic executive agreed. An internal memo, unearthed decades later, quotes an anonymous vice president warning Girdler. "We are not winning. We are poisoning the well." That VP was fired within the month. But cracks were forming. By 1939, Republic would face a rising tide of lawsuits, public boycotts, and congressional threats. The massacre hadn't stopped the Union movement. It had radicalized it. And yet Tom Girdler, the architect of it all, would never face criminal charges. He died in 1965, aged 87, in a luxury apartment overlooking Lake Erie, reportedly dictating anti-union essays until the very end. Republic Steel would merge, reorganize, and eventually disappear into the machinery of modern industrial conglomerates. But the war room, the surveillance, the bloody strategies, they never really went away. Corporate America took notes. Chapter 5: The Wives Who Watched. In the front rows, they stood with strollers. Some held babies. Others held signs. A few clutched purses, ready to hand out sandwiches or water to the men who had marched under the sun to stake their claim in history. They were steelworkers' wives, daughters, sisters, the backbone behind the banner. But on May 30th, 1937, the women weren't just witnesses. They were targets. And they were survivors. Her name was Sophie Scholl. Not the German resistance fighter, but a 29-year-old housewife from Chicago's East Side. She'd packed a picnic lunch for her husband, Paul, a millworker who hadn't seen a paycheck in over a month. With her 3-year-old daughter perched on her hip, she arrived at the strike site wearing her best shoes. "It wasn't supposed to be a fight," she'd later tell a local reporter. "We thought there might be music." Instead, she watched her husband get shot in the leg, fall into the dirt, and nearly bleed out in front of their child. She didn't run. She threw her body over his. And then she was clubbed. Women weren't spared. Not by the police, not by the press, and not by the legacy that came afterward. They were written out of the headlines, out of the hearings, out of the archives. But they were there. In force. And many of them bore the worst scars of all, not on their skin, but in their homes, their marriages, their memories. Underscore 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 underscore. Before the guns, the organizers. The women of South Chicago weren't passive observers in the lead-up to the massacre. They were the quiet engine of the strike. In the weeks prior, they cooked meals for picketers. They ran communications, relaying messages between plants and neighborhoods while the phones were tapped. They hosted union meetings in backyards, kitchens, church basements. And they watched the company spies, often spotting unfamiliar men trailing husbands or loitering near CIO homes. Many of these women had lived through the 1919 steel strike, had seen their fathers and uncles come home bloodied, or not at all. They knew the cost of resistance, but they also knew the cost of silence. One woman, Frances Frankie Velasquez, spoke no English, but taught CIO chants to other wives in Spanish. She led marches through Mexican neighborhoods on the East Side, translating strike bulletins line by line. She was at the rally that day. Her brother was shot through the lung. Her husband never came back from the hospital. She never gave another interview. Not because she was afraid, because she said no one ever asked. Underscore 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 underscore. The attack, through a mother's eyes. When the shooting started, many women had already begun retreating, sensing the tension in the police line. But they weren't fast enough. Tear gas hit indiscriminately. Children screamed. And as the bullets flew, the women dropped to the ground, not to hide but to protect. Testimony collected from survivors, and later published in the 1980s in underground labor zines like the Red Steel Line, painted a chilling picture. They didn't care who you were. They saw a crowd and fired. I yelled that I was pregnant, but the officer kept swinging. That was from Lucille Bratton, who miscarried the next day. She was never listed in the official count of the injured. I saw a boy shot through the leg and his mother screaming for help. The cop pushed her down and told her to go back to Russia. That was Miriam Gold, a Jewish garment worker whose husband had been recruited to help organize the steel pickets. She wasn't even supposed to be at the rally. She had brought food. She went home without her husband. The violence wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. The women were reminders, visible, maternal, innocent, meant to show that this strike was about families, not radicals. To the police, they were propaganda liabilities. The kind you beat early to prevent newsreels later. Underscore 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 underscore. Aftermath, bruises and silence. After the massacre, many of the injured were taken not to hospitals, but to police stations. There, women reported being refused medical attention, mocked, photographed without consent, and in some cases, threatened with deportation. Those who made it home were met with silence. The Chicago Tribune did not print their names. The Senate hearings largely ignored their testimonies. Labor leaders, focused on political outcomes, often sidelined their voices, thinking the optics of hysterical women would undermine the strike's credibility. Even within the labor movement, women were often told, "Let the men handle it." And yet it was the women who carried the weight. They organized fundraisers for the widows. They sewed burial clothes. They demanded church funerals when the city tried to deny public services. They built scrapbooks of clippings, testimony, and photos, underground archives of the truth no one else would print. One such scrapbook, now housed in the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, includes a page smeared with dried blood. The caption reads, "This is my husband's shirt. They said he was a communist. He was a plumber." Underscore 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 underscore. Refusing to forget. In the 1950s, as McCarthyism gripped the country, many of the massacre's survivors, especially the women, were labeled subversive, watched by the FBI, or blacklisted. Some changed their names. Others destroyed their records. But a few didn't. In 1977, on the 40th anniversary of the massacre, a small group of widows and daughters returned to the site, now an empty industrial lot bordered by cracked sidewalks and chain-link fencing. They carried candles. They read the names of the dead. They demanded a monument. It would take another 30 years for the city to agree. Today, a small plaque stands near 117th and Burleigh. Most passers-by miss it. Trucks roar past it. But it's there. Because the women refused to forget. They remembered what the press erased. They buried the dead. And they kept the story alive, not for politics. Not for revenge. But because their children had to know what happened. What the badge did. What the bullet took. And who still carries the bruise. Chapter 6. Echoes in Industry. In the immediate wake of the Memorial Day Massacre, the nation's moral compass seemed to twitch, just slightly, just for a moment. Editorials wrung their hands. Radio commentators shook their heads. Even some steel executives in private admitted that the bloodshed had been regrettable. And yet, when the dust settled, very little had changed. The factories stayed locked. The bodies were buried. The narrative was shaped. And corporate America kept marching. But the massacre didn't vanish. It echoed. Through courtrooms. Through union halls. Through the long, slow mutation of American labor law. Through corporate playbooks. Through security firms. And, more than anyone would admit, through the very psychology of what it means to work in America. The legal fallout that wasn't. One might think that an event this grotesque, 13 dead, dozens wounded, all unarmed, would ignite a flurry of federal legislation. But in practice, the gears barely turned. Yes, the Senate Committee on Education and Labor issued a detailed report. It condemned the Chicago Police Department, described the shootings as wholly unjustified, and recommended immediate federal oversight of labor disputes involving police force. But Congress never passed that bill. Why? Because 1937 was an election year. Because FDR's alliance with Chicago Mayor Edward Kelly was too politically valuable. Because the steel lobby spent more in Washington that year than any other industry except oil. Because labor rights were popular until they made blood pool on sidewalks. Republic Steel, despite national outrage, never paid a single settlement related to the massacre. Police officers who fired into the crowd were not only unpunished, they were commended. One officer, Sergeant James Welch, received a commendation for bravery in the face of disorder. The message was clear: order is profitable. Justice is optional. Underscore 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 underscore. In the shadows of the mills. But in the break rooms on the factory floor and across the bar tops of Youngstown, Cleveland, Gary, and Chicago, the message didn't die. Union membership skyrocketed. In 1936, Republic Steel had just under 1,200 active union members nationwide. By 1941, that number was over 10,000. Why? Because even if the law didn't punish the massacre, memory did. Workers, especially those in the Midwest, began to see the corporations not just as employers, but as tyrants. And that realization shifted everything. In 1942, the CIO finally forced a collective bargaining agreement with Republic Steel, 5 years after the massacre. It was a compromise, but a symbolic one. The union had not been crushed. And in the years that followed, other major steel companies followed suit. But the violence didn't disappear. It just changed form. Blacklisting replaced billy clubs. Litigation replaced lead. Union-busting consultants replaced uniformed thugs. The massacre became a blueprint, not for labor but for management. Underscore 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 underscore. The birth of the corporate counterinsurgency. In the late 1940s, a new industry quietly took shape: labor relations consulting. On its face, it sounded benign. Teams of lawyers and specialists advising companies on how to navigate collective bargaining environments. But in practice, it was psychological warfare. And many of the strategies used could trace their roots to Republic's War Room in 1937. Some examples: behavioral profiling of union leaders to predict vulnerability to coercion. Soft surveillance, including photographing union meetings from parked cars. Disinformation campaigns within factories, spreading rumors, forging fake newsletters, even using planted pro-union voices to push employees toward chaotic behavior that discredited the cause. Hiring ex-military officers to train security teams in crowd suppression techniques. A leaked memo from a steel corporation in 1952 reads, "Mass public violence draws scrutiny. We must isolate agitators quietly, make them look like threats to their own peers." The Memorial Day lesson is, break the spine without spilling the blood. This wasn't industrial relations. It was counterinsurgency, dressed in a tie and carrying a briefcase. And it worked. Underscore 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 underscore. The psychological toll. For those who survived the massacre, especially those who returned to work in the steel mills, there was no closure, no reconciliation, and very little therapy. PTSD wasn't recognized in laborers. Doctors called it nerves or worker fatigue. In reality, it was trauma, and it passed like poison through families. Children grew up hearing whispered stories at kitchen tables, seeing old scars, watching fathers flinch at the sound of sirens. In 1963, a study conducted by labor researcher Dr. Helen Moore at the University of Illinois revealed that 72% of steelworkers who witnessed violence during the strike reported chronic sleep disorders. 59% described experiencing flashback events or vivid memory triggers years later. Over 40% said they would never allow their children to work in steel. The massacre didn't just change how people viewed the job. It made them afraid of their own country. The echo in today's America. Fast forward to the present. In 2012, Amazon was exposed for hiring anti-union consultants at $3,000 a day to discourage warehouse workers from organizing. In 2020, leaked documents from McDonald's revealed detailed surveillance of labor activists using social media monitoring and private security. In 2021, the NLRB ruled that Tesla had illegally retaliated against union activists at its Fremont factory. And in each case, the justification sounded familiar. We're protecting our business from outside agitation. We respect the rights of workers, but not unlawful behavior. We acted in the interest of safety. These are the new uniforms. No badges. No shotguns. Just boardrooms, PR statements, and attorneys. but the message remains the same. You may have rights, but we have resources. The 1937 Memorial Day Massacre was a failure of law, a triumph of power, and a prophecy of how the American workplace would evolve. Not into a democracy of labor, but into a managed arena of psychological, economic, and legal control. The names change. The weapons change. The blood sometimes stays invisible. But the bruise is still there. You can feel it in every closed factory, in every surveilled warehouse, in every whisper in the break room, in every vote cast under watchful eyes. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo. We just wanted a union. Chapter 7, Blood Memory, the Resurrection of a Crime. For 30 years, the massacre existed mostly in whispers. No statues, no documentaries, no school lessons. The Memorial Day Massacre of 1937 was allowed to dissolve into the fog of industrial forgetfulness, buried beneath corporate myth and American amnesia. It was easier that way, for the city, for the company, for the press, and perhaps even for the country itself. But memory, real memory, isn't a passive act. It's a fight. And somewhere in the shadows of South Chicago, that fight never ended. The first resurrection, an archive in a basement. It started, as many things do, with a woman going through boxes. Nancy Miller, a second-generation steelworker's daughter and part-time high school history teacher in Chicago's East Side, had grown up hearing only fragments of the massacre. Her grandfather had seen something bad. Her mother didn't want to talk about it. But in 1969, while cleaning out her late uncle's home, she found something remarkable. In a dust-covered trunk, buried beneath layers of yellowed newspapers and rusted tools, was a hand-stitched scrapbook. The birth of the corporate counterinsurgency. In the late 1940s, a new industry quietly took shape: labor relations consulting. On its face, it sounded benign. Teams of lawyers and specialists advising companies on how to navigate collective bargaining environments. But in practice, it was psychological warfare. And many of the strategies used could trace their roots to Republic's War Room in 1937. Some examples: behavioral profiling of union leaders to predict vulnerability to coercion. Soft surveillance, including photographing union meetings from parked cars. Disinformation campaigns within factories, spreading rumors, forging fake newsletters, even using planted pro-union voices to push employees toward chaotic behavior that discredited the cause. Hiring ex-military officers to train security teams in crowd suppression techniques. A leaked memo from a steel corporation in 1952 reads, "Mass public violence draws scrutiny. We must isolate agitators quietly, make them look like threats to their own peers." The Memorial Day lesson is, break the spine without spilling the blood. This wasn't industrial relations. It was counterinsurgency, dressed in a tie and carrying a briefcase. And it worked. The psychological toll. For those who survived the massacre, especially those who returned to work in the steel mills, there was no closure, no reconciliation, and very little therapy. PTSD wasn't recognized in laborers. Doctors called it nerves or worker fatigue. In reality, it was trauma, and it passed like poison through families. Children grew up hearing whispered stories at kitchen tables, seeing old scars, watching fathers flinch at the sound of sirens. In 1963, a study conducted by labor researcher Dr. Helen Moore at the University of Illinois revealed that 72% of steelworkers who witnessed violence during the strike reported chronic sleep disorders. 59% described experiencing flashback events or vivid memory triggers years later. Over 40% said they would never allow their children to work in steel. The massacre didn't just change how people viewed the job. It made them afraid of their own country. The echo in today's America. Fast forward to the present. In 2012, Amazon was exposed for hiring anti-union consultants at $3,000 a day to discourage warehouse workers from organizing. In 2020, leaked documents from McDonald's revealed detailed surveillance of labor activists using social media monitoring and private security. In 2021, the NLRB ruled that Tesla had illegally retaliated against union activists at its Fremont factory. And in each case, the justification sounded familiar. We're protecting our business from outside agitation. We respect the rights of workers, but not unlawful behavior. We acted in the interest of safety. These are the new uniforms. No badges. No shotguns. Just boardrooms, PR statements, and attorneys. But the message remains the same. You may have rights, but we have resources. The 1937 Memorial Day Massacre was a failure of law, a triumph of power, and a prophecy of how the American workplace would evolve. Not into a democracy of labor, but into a managed arena of psychological, economic, and legal control. The names change. The weapons change. The blood sometimes stays invisible. But the bruise is still there. You can feel it in every closed factory, in every surveilled warehouse, in every whisper in the break room, in every vote cast under watchful eyes. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo. We just wanted a union. Chapter 7, Blood Memory, the Resurrection of a Crime. For 30 years, the massacre existed mostly in whispers. No statues, no documentaries, no school lessons. The Memorial Day Massacre of 1937 was allowed to dissolve into the fog of industrial forgetfulness, buried beneath corporate myth and American amnesia. It was easier that way, for the city, for the company, for the press, and perhaps even for the country itself. But memory, real memory, isn't a passive act. It's a fight. And somewhere in the shadows of South Chicago, that fight never ended. The first resurrection, an archive in a basement. It started, as many things do, with a woman going through boxes. Nancy Miller, a second-generation steelworker's daughter and part-time high school history teacher in Chicago's East Side, had grown up hearing only fragments of the massacre. Her grandfather had seen something bad. Her mother didn't want to talk about it. But in 1969, while cleaning out her late uncle's home, she found something remarkable. In a dust-covered trunk, buried beneath layers of yellowed newspapers and rusted tools, was a hand-stitched scrapbook. Read aloud, one by one, as they were buried, because in America memory is a battlefield. And for some crimes, the only justice is to remember. Chapter 8, A Crime with No Convictions. There were no trials, no indictments, no subpoenas, no charges filed, no officers suspended, no executives interrogated, no judge, no jury, no courtroom testimony cross-examined under oath. 13 American citizens were gunned down in broad daylight, shot in the back as they ran. Dozens more were beaten, gassed, arrested, and humiliated. And not a single person responsible for the bloodshed ever faced legal consequences. Let that sink in, because that, right there, is the real crime. The structure of immunity. Let's break it down. The shooters were members of the Chicago Police Department, a publicly funded, uniformed arm of the state. Their actions that day were not rogue. They were not vigilantes. They were ordered into position equipped with riot gear, gas, and live ammunition, and deployed to protect a private corporation. Who gave the order? That's the question that's never been answered. Was it Mayor Edward J. Kelly? Was it Police Superintendent James Allman? Was it an off-the-books directive from Republic Steel's War Room, relayed through a whisper campaign into City Hall? No one knows. And no one in power ever cared to find out. The Chicago Tribune, in the days following the massacre, ran glowing praise of the police response. The editorial board called it necessary to prevent mob violence, despite the complete lack of evidence that any violence had been initiated by the strikers. Their source? The Chicago Police Department. The Cook County Coroner's inquest, rushed and incomplete, accepted police testimony at face value, ignored eyewitness accounts from civilians, and ultimately ruled all deaths either justifiable or resulting from an unfortunate riot. Let that linger. The state killed its own citizens, and the state decided it was justified. There was no appeal. The corporate defense, deny everything. Tom Girdler, president of Republic Steel, was never subpoenaed by a criminal court. He refused to appear before the Senate committee in person, sending instead a statement claiming, "Republic Steel has always acted within the bounds of legality and has not condoned violence. The company is not responsible for the actions of public police forces." It was a masterclass in plausible deniability. Republic Steel had coordinated with the city. Republic Steel had demanded police protection. Republic Steel had stockpiled gas and arms. Republic Steel had a private surveillance apparatus that reported directly to management. But because the trigger was pulled by men in blue, not men in suits, the company walked away clean. And what about Paramount newsreel? Their footage, perhaps the most damning single piece of evidence in the case, was buried for months. Only public pressure forced it into partial release. And even then, major studios and broadcasters avoided it. Why? Because corporations protect corporations. Because media empires don't go to war with industrial giants. Because violence against workers is always treated as regrettable, but never criminal. Victim blaming as doctrine. If there was one unifying thread in the official response to the massacre, it was this: blame the victims. Almost every man shot that day was posthumously labeled a radical, a troublemaker, or a communist. Republic's internal memos refer to the dead not as employees, but as disruptive elements. The city's PR machine pushed the narrative that these were outsiders, despite the fact that every one of the dead lived within a few miles of the plant. Even the Senate's La Follette Committee, despite issuing a brutal report condemning the massacre, failed to recommend criminal prosecutions. Why? Because in 1937, there was no appetite for jailing police. No legal framework for holding a corporation liable for deaths committed by public servants at its request. No interest in a national reckoning with the ways American labor was being slaughtered in broad daylight. How many more? The Memorial Day Massacre is not unique in its lack of justice. It's part of a long and ugly lineage in America. The Ludlow Massacre, 1914. No convictions. The Haymarket Affair, 1886. The convicted were the workers. Kent State, 1970. The National Guardsmen walked free. Attica Prison Uprising, 1971. 39 dead. No state troopers prosecuted. In each case, the violence was public. The dead were real. The wounds were national. And in each case, the powerful walked away. The final indictment. So here it is. This is the courtroom we never got. This is the trial they never held. This is the indictment history should have delivered. To Tom Girdler, for inciting violence through direct coordination with armed police forces. To Mayor Edward Kelly, for greenlighting a militarized crackdown on peaceful assembly. To the Chicago Police Department, for firing live ammunition into a crowd of unarmed citizens and then perjuring themselves to escape responsibility. To the Chicago Press, for enabling the erasure of the truth and defaming the dead. To the federal government, for refusing to enforce the Wagner Act and for abandoning the workers it had pledged to protect. And to the American justice system, for proving once again that when the blood runs from the poor, no one hears the sirens. Chapter 9. Until the grass grows back. The field where it happened is quiet now. No banners. No brass bands. No clouds of gas or rising gunfire. Just an empty lot on the edge of South Chicago, bordered by a chain-link fence and paved over with time. You'd pass it without a second glance, unless you knew. Unless someone had told you. If you stand there long enough, close your eyes, and let the wind carry, you might still hear it. The chants. The screams. The boots. The reports of rifles. The crying. The silence that followed. For decades, there wasn't even a plaque. Just dirt and weeds. As if the city hoped the grass would grow tall enough to cover the blood. As if the story would fade like rust on a mill wall. But it didn't. Because some stories fight back. Because blood memory does not rot. Because someone kept the names. Because someone remembered where they fell. Because someone made sure the grass never grew too tall. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a massacre. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a message. And this wasn't justice denied, it was justice obliterated. Deliberately. Systemically. Proudly. So we remember. Not because it changes the past, but because it tells the truth about the present. About how power moves. About who gets believed. About who gets shot and who gets away with it. The 1937 Memorial Day Massacre isn't over. It echoes every time a worker is told they don't belong at the table. It echoes in every tear-gassed crowd, every cracked baton, every surveillance camera aimed at the break room door. It echoes in every silence we pretend is peace. But now you know. And once you know, you don't forget. Next time on AI True Crime, we're trading steel for speed. Next week we take you to New Jersey, 1980s lawless, sunburned, and soaked in chlorine. No seatbelts. No brakes. No rules. We're diving headfirst into the deadly chaos of Action Park, the most infamous, out-of-control amusement park in American history, where injuries were a guarantee, lawsuits were constant, and the body count was real. Was it negligence? Was it murder? Or was it something even stranger? A thrill ride that turned into a death trap? The intelligence is artificial, but the crime is real.